Hello, my name is Trey, and welcome to Telos Bound. I'm sick today, but we're soldiering on, and we're going to discuss Žižek's book Hegel in a Wired Brain, focusing specifically on what he writes about the subject and his predictions concerning its status in the wired brain. I will not be focusing on the political or ethical aspects of the book, but will get down to the zero level of Žižek's thought concerning the nature of subjectivity and its destiny in the face of developing neurotechnologies. For this video, I'll be focusing only on the nature of the subject as Žižek presents it in the book. The two most elementary characteristics of the subject for Žižek are self-relating and negativity. This is why he, quite fittingly, refers to subjectivity as self-relating negativity. To begin with the concept of self-relating, we can reference the mathematicians Georg Cantor and Kurt Gödel, who Žižek briefly introduces in the beginning of Hegel in a Wired Brain. Cantor created set theory, which demonstrates the necessity of multiple infinities by virtue of the nature of self-relating. And Gödel formulated the incompleteness theorem, which proved that every system necessarily produces statements which can neither be proven nor disproven by it. The importance of these men for Žižek is that they discovered that paradox and inconsistency are immanent to mathematics itself. They are not merely failures in our knowledge which are to be overcome. If anyone has a basic familiarity with Žižek's thought, they could see how this relates to his distinction between Kant and Hegel. For Kant, the antinomies of reason are entirely epistemological, while for Hegel, reality itself is antinomic. The most basic level of antinomy for Žižek is the subject itself, which, in its self-relating negativity, is incapable of jumping on its own shoulders and positing something outside of its own activity. This paradox was first approached by the German philosopher Johann Fichte, who was the first person to break from Kant's notion of the thing in itself and fully embrace his transcendental turn. For Fichte, the subject is the totality. It is the infinite ego. There is nothing outside of its own activity. However, as Žižek proves in a detailed discussion of what he calls Fichte's choice in Chapter 3 of Less Than Nothing, Fichte's self-positing infinite ego is only infinite insofar as it is finite. This can be understood if we take into account the Hegelian thesis that it is only possible to be aware of a limit to anything by knowing what is beyond the limit. The subject which by definition cannot access the dimension of otherness is paradoxically limitless. This is the elementary paradox of self-relating which constitutes subjectivity, as the subject is nothing more than its own self-positing of itself. It has no substantial existence outside of this act of self-relating, and it is only by taking it into account that we can touch the real. As Žižek puts it, quote, "The lesson of both Hegel and Lacan is every vision of objective reality is already constituted through transcendental subjectivity, and we only touch the real when we include in the scope of our vision the cut in the real of subjectivity itself." Unquote. Let us now discuss the concept of negativity, which is the other side of self-relating. The subject is self-relating negativity because both of these concepts are coextensive with each other. If the subject is nothing more than its own self-relating, a complete overlap between its activity and the result of this activity, then it is also necessarily a withdrawal from the world into itself. It is therefore characterized by its negative opposition to reality. However, we are now confronted with another paradox, which is the subject's inability to have a consciousness of itself as its self-relating negativity. In order to understand this, we must return to the aforementioned quote concerning the nature of limitation and knowledge. It is, quote, "only possible to be aware of a limit to anything by knowing what is beyond the limit," unquote. The subject is, by definition, incapable of accessing the beyond, and it's therefore incapable of knowing its limitations and seeing itself as an individual in the world. Knowledge of anything requires a form of distance, such as the distance between a subject and its object. The subject can only perceive the object insofar as it is outside of the subject and within its perceptual field. However, self-consciousness itself is nothing more than its own self-relating gesture of withdrawal, and in being so it doesn't have an ability to see itself in totality, as this seeing would necessarily have some underlying foundation that is outside of its perceptual field as its very source. Self-consciousness, then, at its most elementary level, is unconscious. Therefore, the Freudian unconscious is nothing more than self-consciousness itself. This unconscious reflexivity is not a part of the world insofar as it necessarily cannot be located in it. It is always situated within the ungraspable beyond, but not a substantial beyond, but a pure void. As Žižek puts it, quote, I, as a viewing subject, am never directly part of the world in which my perception takes place, since every reality that I perceive already relies on my specific subjective standpoint. By definition, I cannot directly locate myself in reality, since this would mean that I somehow stepped out of myself and looked at myself objectively, from nowhere. This means that I, as a subject, am not directly part of my world. I, of course, have no substantial reality out of the world, but I am the void, what Hegel calls the pure self-relating negativity, that enables the constitution of a specific reality, Manzotti's transitory whole, in the midst of the chaotic, unorientable real, unquote. After taking all of this into account, we can then understand why, for Žižek, the Freudian unconscious is synonymous with the Cartesian Cogito. The Cartesian Cogito is not understood by Žižek in any substantialist way, but as self-relating negativity. To quote him once again, quote, Descartes was the first anti-humanist thinker. His cogito should be strictly distinguished from what we call human personality, all the wealth of inner life. The high epoch of humanism was the Renaissance, which celebrates human beings as the highest among all creatures, as a creature of expressivity, creatively bringing out its inner depth, deploying its inner potentials. The Cartesian subject is quite another thing, an inhuman void, an empty point of self-relating negativity, unquote. This inhuman void is self-consciousness itself at its zero level, which paradoxically reverts into what seems to be its opposite, the unconscious. It is not self-consciousness as we normally think of it, because it is precisely not conscious of itself. It is a more fundamental reflexive act which precedes any consciousness one has of oneself. According to Žižek, this understanding of the unconscious was first formulated by Jacques Lacan, who Žižek opposes to Jean-Paul Sartre. Quote, for Sartre, the basic free act by means of which a subject chooses itself, formulates the existential project that defines its identity, is an act of self-consciousness. For Sartre, the unconscious is a substantial reified entity, something that objectively determines me. For Lacan, on the contrary, the primordial choice is unconscious, since the unconscious is not a substantial determination of the subject, but the most basic level of reflexivity, unquote. This unconscious reflexivity is, quote-unquote, behind every free act of choosing one's identity for oneself as conceived by the existentialists. However, I'd like to add a personal comment because I'm not actually sure Žižek really understands Sartre's understanding of consciousness as he presents it in Being and Nothingness. Because for Sartre, every act of formulating one's own identity is preceded by the pre-reflective cogito, which is essentially the ungraspable foundation which, to use Žižek's language, cannot be located in reality. In fact, I don't even see any essential difference between Žižek's distinction between the subject's unconscious and its inner life, and Sartre's distinction between the pre-reflective cogito and what he calls psychic states. Of course, Žižek emphasizes negativity and self-relating more than Sartre, but I see the basic distinction made between the two domains of subjectivity as essentially the same for both of them. In any case, I thought I'd just mention that because I find it interesting, and if someone watching has a better understanding of Sartre than myself, please comment your take on this. In any case, Žižek's distinction between the unconscious subject of the void and its inner life is crucial because it becomes the basis of his critique of many modern visions of the wired brain and the singularity. As previously mentioned, Žižek associates the subject's inner life, or wealth of personality, with the humanism of the Renaissance. Descartes stands in contrast to the Renaissance because the cogito is precisely nothing but the quote-unquote inhuman void. This distinction between the cogito and the empirical life of the subject can be traced back to Immanuel Kant's distinction between transcendental and empirical apperception. I'm not going to go into that because I am very much aware of how complex things already are, but if you would like to do your own reading, go to the Critique of Pure Reason, the section entitled Transcendental Deduction of the Pure Concepts of Understanding. Moving on, the empirical wealth of personality is what Žižek also refers to more simply as the subject's content. This content is always alienated from what may be called the form of the subject, which, to avoid confusion, is the Cartesian cogito / the unconscious. This is why the subject is always internally divided. To quote him, for Hegel, The one of self-identity is not just always inconsistent, fractured, antagonistic, etc. Identity itself is the assertion of radical self-difference. To say that something is identical with itself means that it is distinct from all its particular properties, that it cannot be reduced to them. A rose is a rose means that a rose is something more than all its features. There is some je ne sais quoi which makes it a rose, something more in a rose than the rose itself. As this last example indicates, we are also dealing here with what Lacan called objet petit a, the mysterious X beneath all its properties that makes an object what it is, that sustains its unique identity, unquote. So we see here the idea that there is always more than the substantial content of a thing which constitutes its identity as such. In the context of the subject, its inner life is its content, which is divided from the unconscious void filled in by objet a. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to discuss objet a in detail, as it deserves a separate video, and Žižek only mentions it a few times in the book, so it's clearly not necessary to really grasp it in order to understand what he's trying to do in this particular context. So to move on, what should be taken from the previous quote is that the subject is divided between its unconscious and its content, because the unconscious is always the mysterious X which avoids symbolization by precisely being outside of reality in a certain sense. Now, before ending this first video, we have to briefly touch on negativity and virtuality. Anyone familiar with Žižek even a little bit will be familiar with his coffee without cream joke. Here's a clip of him saying it.
There is a wonderful joke in Ernst Lubitsch's masterpiece, Ninochka. The hero visits a cafeteria and orders coffee without cream. And here is the wonderful reply of the waiter. Sorry, we have run out of cream. We only have milk. Can I then bring you coffee without milk?
The difference between coffee without milk and coffee without cream is completely virtual. In its substantial content, there is no difference, but there is nonetheless a virtual or negative difference which is only registered by a living subject, who is itself self-relating negativity. As Žižek puts it, quote, "In order to register the difference between plain coffee and coffee without milk, a subject has to be operative. Subjectivity equals here reflexivity. When plain coffee is experienced as coffee without milk and not coffee without cream, the counterfactual status of milk or cream is this coffee's purely reflexive determination, not its actual determination." So, now let us briefly summarize everything which we have discussed in this video. The subject at its core is the pure void beyond all its positive properties. It is both the unconscious and the zero level of self-consciousness. It does not have any substantial existence in itself. It is nothing more than its own gesture of self-relating withdrawal from the world. Furthermore, it is incapable of apprehending itself as an individual in the world because this would imply a certain distance from itself due to the very laws of reflection and perspective. This unconscious cogito is distinguished from the inner life of the subject, which is all its positive properties, or its psychological wealth of personality. Furthermore, only the subject, which is itself negativity, is able to register the negative/virtual difference between coffee without milk and coffee without cream. All of these are crucial to keep in mind as we move into the next video, where we will be discussing neurotechnologies such as Elon Musk's Neuralink and Ray Kurzweil's hypothetical singularity. And that's the end of the video. Thank you everyone for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I've left all my sources in the description, plus some other links that you may be interested to check out. If you know anyone who may find my content interesting, please share this channel with them. It would be greatly appreciated as I'm trying to grow it in these first few weeks. Okay, thank you for watching, and may God bless you all.